There's a moment most men don't see coming, the moment her regret begins. Not when you're fighting to keep her, explaining yourself, or holding on a little longer, but after you've already let go. That's the strange truth. Her regret doesn't show up in the chaos of trying to fix things. It shows up later, in the quiet space your detachment creates when your attention stops orbiting her, and your presence no longer asks for reassurance or validation. In this video, we'll break down why her regret comes after your detachment, what shifts when you stop reaching, and why this is about calm, grounded, self-respect, not manipulation. If this resonates, like the video, subscribe to the channel and stay with us as we walk through it step by step. Number 1. The moment you stop chasing. Her regret doesn't begin with a fight, a dramatic ending, or a clear moment of loss. It begins much earlier and much quieter at the exact moment you stop chasing clarity, reassurance, or emotional control. This is the moment most men overlook, because from the outside, nothing seems to change. There's no confrontation, no final words, no obvious shift in behavior. But internally, the entire dynamic starts to reorganize itself. When you were chasing, your energy was constantly moving outward. You wanted answers. You wanted emotional alignment. You wanted certainty about where you stood. That pursuit made you readable, predictable, adjustable. If she pulled back, you leaned forward. If she grew uncertain, you tried to stabilize the situation. Even when your intentions were sincere, your availability made the emotional structure flexible around her moods. She didn't need to wonder where you were. Your reactions told her everything. The moment you stop chasing, that outward flow of energy reverses. Not dramatically, not with anger or silence meant to punish. It simply returns to you. You stop trying to resolve ambiguity. You stop negotiating for reassurance. You allow questions to remain unanswered. And that's when something unfamiliar enters her emotional field. A pause, a loss of reference, the sense that you are no longer orienting yourself around her responses. This is where Stoic restraint quietly comes into play. Stoicism teaches that desire aimed outward weakens a man, not because desire itself is wrong, but because dependence on outcomes erodes self-command. When you withdraw pursuit without resentment, you aren't creating distance, you're creating gravity. Gravity doesn't chase, it doesn't argue, it doesn't convince. It simply exists, and others feel its pull when they move too far away. From her perspective, this shift is disorienting. Not painful yet, but noticeable. The emotional leverage she once had dissolves. Not because you took it back forcefully, but because you stopped offering it freely. She feels the absence of your pursuit long before she feels regret. And that absence plants the first seed of it. Number 2. When your absence feels different. Absence on its own isn't what unsettles her. She has experienced distance before arguments, emotional pullbacks, moments of tension where silence was charged and reactive. That kind of absence feels loud. It carries emotion. It demands resolution. Even when it's uncomfortable, it's familiar. She knows how to interpret it, and more importantly, she knows how to respond to it. But detachment creates a different kind of absence, a heavier one. When your silence isn't fueled by anger, disappointment, or the need to be understood, it doesn't echo the same way. It doesn't ask for attention. It doesn't hint at resentment. It doesn't wait for the right words to restart the conversation. It simply exists, grounded and unresolved. And that's precisely why she feels it more deeply. She senses the difference almost immediately. This isn't silence meant to provoke a reaction. It's silence that doesn't need one. There's no emotional tension leaking through it, no pressure, no signal that says, if you just say the right thing, this will soften. Instead, there's a quiet finality to it, not an ending, but a self-contained presence that no longer orbits her emotional state. Stoic detachment isn't emotional withdrawal. It's emotional self-command. You're not suppressing feelings or pretending not to care. You're simply no longer letting emotion dictate movement. You're no longer reacting in ways that make your inner world visible and adjustable. And because of that, your absence doesn't feel like a tactic. It feels like a truth. This is where her mind begins to linger, not because she's being punished, but because she can't locate you emotionally the way she used to. There's no emotional noise to interpret, no drama to resolve, no urgency to fix. And without those cues, her thoughts slow down and deepen. Anger-driven silence fades quickly once emotions settle. Detached absence doesn't. It stays present in the background of her thoughts, not demanding attention, but quietly occupying space. She notices it during unrelated moments. She wonders about it without realizing why. And slowly, that weight becomes more significant than any argument ever was. This is when absence stops being empty and starts becoming unforgettable. And this is the moment where everything quietly turns inward. Nothing needs to be decided yet. Nothing needs to be fixed or explained. The shift you've just heard about isn't loud enough to demand action, but it's strong enough to invite reflection. Take a second to notice where this resonates with your own experience, where silence changed shape instead of simply ending. If this perspective is landing for you, tap the like button so more men can find it, and leave a comment sharing what stood out, or simply type, "My calm no longer chases," to mark the moment you recognize this shift. Number 3. You no longer seek closure. There comes a quiet point where you stop asking questions, not because you finally received satisfying answers, but because you no longer need them. You stop replaying conversations in your head. You stop looking for explanations that would make everything feel settled. You stop chasing emotional clarity as if it were a missing piece you can still retrieve. Nothing dramatic announces this shift. It happens internally, when the need to know loosens its grip on you. Before this moment, closure felt essential. You believed that understanding her reasons would bring peace, that if she could just explain herself clearly enough, you could finally relax, accept, and move on. But what actually kept you stuck wasn't the lack of answers. It was the belief that your peace depended on them. Every unanswered question kept you oriented toward her inner world instead of your own. Stoicism approaches this differently. It teaches acceptance of what lies outside your control, not as resignation, but as clarity. You begin to recognize that another person's feelings, decisions, and timing do not belong to you. And once that understanding settles in, you stop negotiating with uncertainty. You don't demand emotional resolution from someone who may not even understand herself. You allow the ambiguity to exist without trying to conquer it. This is the moment your energy truly detaches. Not because you've won or healed perfectly, but because you've reclaimed authority over where your attention goes. You stop asking why and start asking how you will live regardless. And in doing so, you remove yourself from the emotional courtroom where you were waiting for a verdict. Ironically, this is when the dynamic reverses. When you no longer seek closure, she begins to feel its absence. The conversations that never happened, the questions left unanswered, the emotional loose ends, these now sit with her instead of you. She senses that you've stopped waiting, that you're no longer standing in the doorway hoping for clarity. And that unsettles her, because closure is only powerful when someone still needs it. The moment you release the need for explanations, you become emotionally unavailable in a new way, not distant, but complete. And from that position, her curiosity awakens. She begins searching for the very clarity you no longer require. This is where regret starts to form, not from loss, but from realization. Number 4, her certainty starts to crack. Her certainty was never built on words or promises. It was built on patterns, on repetition, on knowing, without consciously thinking about it, how you would respond. When you were emotionally available, she could feel your position clearly. She knew where she stood. She knew how much space she had. She knew what would happen if she pulled back or leaned in. Your reactions filled in the blanks before any real uncertainty could form. That certainty created comfort, and comfort, while often mistaken for connection, is rooted in predictability. When your emotions were accessible and responsive, she didn't have to wonder. Your presence adjusted to her mood. Your tone shifted with hers. Even silence had a meaning she understood, because it usually led to reassurance or explanation. She wasn't guessing. You made the emotional landscape legible. Calm detachment disrupts that without creating chaos. You don't become cold. You don't withdraw dramatically. You don't change your behavior in ways that demand attention. Instead, you remain composed. Your reactions slow down. Your emotional output becomes measured rather than automatic. And for the first time, her expectations stop being consistently fed. Stoics understood this deeply. Certainty dissolves not when conflict appears, but when expectations are no longer rewarded. When a man stops reinforcing assumptions with predictable behavior, the sense of control quietly erodes. You're still present, still respectful, still grounded, but no longer emotionally transparent on demand. This introduces a new kind of uncertainty. Not the anxious kind that comes from instability, but the reflective kind that comes from losing emotional access. She begins to notice gaps where responses used to be, pauses where reassurance once arrived, calm where emotional negotiation once lived, and those gaps invite thought. At first, it doesn't feel like regret. It feels like mild disorientation. She replays interactions. She tests the tone of conversations. She wonders not dramatically, but persistently what changed. And the unsettling part isn't that you left, it's that you didn't. You remained steady without being available in the old way. This is where regret quietly begins. Not because she suddenly fears losing you, but because the emotional certainty she relied on has vanished. She can no longer locate herself through your reactions. And without that reference point, something fragile cracks inside her sense of stability. Regret doesn't arrive as pain at first. It arrives as doubt, soft, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Number 5. You remove emotional leverage. Emotional leverage only exists when there is something to pull on. A reaction, a sensitivity, a predictable emotional response that can be activated with the right timing or tone. When you were attached, those handles were visible. Not because you were weak, but because you were invested. Your care made you responsive. Your hope made you flexible. And that flexibility gave the dynamic its unspoken power structure. Detachment quietly dismantles that structure. When you stop chasing, explaining, or trying to influence outcomes, emotional leverage disappears. There's nothing to provoke, because provocation no longer moves you. Nothing to test, because tests no longer produce data. Nothing to pull, because your inner state isn't tethered to her reactions anymore. From the outside, this can look subtle, even confusing, but internally, it's a complete shift in authority. Stoicism frames power not as dominance over others, but as self-governance. A man who governs himself is not rigid or closed. He's simply unmoved by forces that once dictated his behavior. He feels emotions, but they don't drive him. He listens, but he doesn't chase. He's present, but not reactive. And because of that, he leaves no exposed edges for others to grip. This is where the dynamic changes in a way she can't control. Before, she could sense when distance would bring you closer, or when warmth would soften you. Even uncertainty had a predictable effect. Now, those mechanisms fail. Emotional strategies that once worked no longer register. And without leverage, there's nothing to manage. That's when reflection replaces control. Instead of adjusting her behavior to steer your response, she starts questioning her assumptions. Instead of testing your availability, she starts noticing its absence. Not as rejection, but as independence. Your emotional neutrality isn't dismissive, it's complete. And completeness is unsettling to someone used to influence. This is also where respect begins to quietly return. Not because you demanded it, but because you no longer needed anything from her to remain centered. Your calm becomes non-negotiable. Your boundaries don't require explanation, and your presence no longer fluctuates based on emotional reward. When emotional leverage disappears, the dynamic stops being interactive and starts being internal for her. And that internal shift is where regret begins to deepen, because control is gone, and what replaces it is awareness. Before moving on, pause for a moment and sit with what this really means. If emotional leverage only exists when there's something to pull on, ask yourself what changed when you stopped offering those handles. How did your calm alter the dynamic? Not through force, but through absence of need. Take a second to reflect on where you felt this shift in your own life. And if it resonates, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, or simply type, "My calm is no longer negotiable." Your reflection matters, and it often clarifies more than silence ever could. Number 6. Silence becomes a mirror. At first, silence is often misunderstood. It's easy to label it as punishment, avoidance, or passive aggression, especially when silence used to follow conflict or emotional tension. But your silence now doesn't carry that charge. It isn't reactive. It doesn't arrive after an argument or linger with unresolved emotion. It simply exists, steady and unforced. And because of that, it starts to function differently. It becomes a mirror. When your emotional presence no longer fills the space, something subtle happens. The noise quiets. The usual back and forth, the emotional cues, the reassurance, the reactions, none of them arrive to shape the moment. And without that external input, she's left with her own thoughts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, clearly. Before, your emotional availability acted as a buffer. It softened discomfort. It redirected uncertainty outward. If something felt unresolved, it could be diffused through conversation, reassurance, or emotional engagement. Silence interrupted that process, but your silence now doesn't interrupt. It removes itself. And in that removal, reflection begins. Stoics valued silence, not as avoidance, but as observation. Silence creates space. Space allows perception. When you stop narrating your inner world, you stop guiding the emotional direction of the moment. You're no longer explaining, clarifying, or managing how things are felt. You're simply present or absent without commentary. And that lack of commentary invites attention inward. This is where the mirror effect takes hold. She begins to notice her own patterns, her own assumptions, her own unresolved feelings. Without your emotional signals to react to, there's nothing to distract from them. The questions she didn't ask before surface naturally. The emotional weight she didn't feel before becomes harder to ignore. And this isn't because you intended it. That's the key difference. Silence meant to provoke demands a response. Silence rooted in self-command doesn't. It allows whatever is present to rise on its own. And what rises is often clarity. Observation reveals what distraction once hid. And in that clarity, regret doesn't crash in loudly. It forms quietly, as understanding, not about what you did or didn't say, but about what your absence now makes visible. Number 7. You continue living fully. One of the most misunderstood aspects of detachment is the idea that it makes a man smaller, quieter, less engaged with life. In reality, the opposite happens. Detachment doesn't shrink your world, it expands it. When you stop organizing your energy around one emotional outcome, that energy doesn't disappear. It redirects, and what it flows into begins to grow. Instead of monitoring messages, interpreting tone, or waiting for emotional cues, your attention returns to what was quietly neglected: purpose, discipline, direction. You begin filling your days with things that move you forward rather than things that keep you emotionally paused. Work becomes more focused. Training becomes more consistent. Your routines tighten not out of obsession, but out of clarity. You're no longer living in reaction. You're living in intention. Stoicism never promoted withdrawal from life. It promoted freedom from dependency. The Stoic ideal wasn't isolation, but engagement without attachment. You still participate fully, still invest effort, still experience emotion, but you don't hinge your sense of self on how someone else responds. Your life gains momentum because it's no longer waiting for permission to move. From her perspective, this shift is unmistakable. Not because you announce it, but because it shows. Your energy feels different, lighter, self-contained. You're no longer carrying the weight of unspoken expectation. And that absence of bitterness matters more than most men realize. You didn't walk away angry. You didn't collapse into distraction. You didn't stall. You kept going. That's what deepens regret. Not the fact that you left, but the realization that you didn't stop, that her absence didn't derail you, that your life continued to expand without emotional residue dragging behind it. There's no guilt to resolve, no anger to soothe, no broken man to fix. Just forward motion. And forward motion is confronting. It forces comparison, not between words, but between trajectories. She begins to sense that the version of you she once had access to is no longer available, not because you closed the door, but because you walked through another one. Regret forms there, quietly, deeply, not as longing for the past, but as recognition of what kept moving when she didn't. Number 8. Her timing falls behind yours. Regret rarely arrives on time. It tends to surface after the moment has already passed, once the emotional conditions that made it possible no longer exist. By the time she begins to feel it, you've already realigned internally. Not rushed, not hardened, simply no longer where you were when it might have mattered. When you were attached, your timing was reactive. You waited for clarity, for reassurance, for her emotional readiness to catch up with yours. You slowed your movement to stay synchronized. You paused decisions. You kept emotional doors open longer than they needed to be, not out of weakness, but out of hope. Hope that alignment would eventually arrive if you remained available long enough. Stoic patience teaches something different. It isn't about waiting indefinitely. It's about moving at your own pace, regardless of whether others are ready to follow. Patience, in this sense, is not delay, it's discipline. The discipline to act in accordance with your values, even when emotional signals are unclear or inconsistent. When you stop waiting for someone else's readiness, your trajectory shifts quietly but decisively. This is where timing diverges. You don't announce the shift. You don't close doors dramatically. You simply stop standing still. Your internal alignment begins to take precedence over emotional possibility. You make decisions based on clarity rather than potential. And as you do, the emotional space where regret could have landed starts to move away from her. By the time she begins to feel the weight of what changed your steadiness, your absence, your forward motion, you're no longer oriented toward the past. You're not replaying moments. You're not standing in the emotional doorway waiting to be met. You've already stepped into a different rhythm. That's what makes her realization miss you. Not because you became unreachable, but because you became aligned. Your life no longer pauses at the edge of uncertainty. Your decisions no longer hinge on emotional timing that isn't yours to control. And when regret finally surfaces for her, it doesn't meet resistance or bitterness. It meets distance created by movement. Regret feels heavier when it arrives late. Not because the opportunity vanished suddenly, but because it dissolved gradually as you kept going. And by the time she reaches for what she finally understands, you're no longer standing where she left you. Take a moment to sit with what this really means. Notice how often your own life once paused at the edge of someone else's readiness, and how different it feels when you no longer wait for emotional permission to keep moving. This isn't about blame or victory. It's about recognizing the quiet power of alignment and timing that belongs to you. If this resonates, reflect on where you stopped standing still, and share your thoughts in the comments. Or simply type, "I move forward in my own time," to mark that shift for yourself. Number 9. You no longer react to tests. The tests don't stop when you detach, they change form. Sudden warmth where there was distance, a casual message after silence, a shift in tone that feels intentional but undefined. These moments used to pull you back in. They created urgency. They invited interpretation. They tempted you to re-engage emotionally before you were even aware it was happening. Before, each signal felt meaningful. A small opening felt like hope. A brief warmth felt like progress. Distance felt like a problem to solve. And because you reacted quickly, the tests worked. They generated data. They revealed how invested you still were, how easily your emotional state could be influenced by timing and tone. Now, something has changed. The signals still arrive, but they pass through you without urgency. You don't rush to interpret them. You don't assign them immediate meaning. You don't escalate warmth or chase distance. You notice, but you don't move. And in that stillness, the entire function of the test collapses. Stoicism teaches that time reveals truth better than reaction ever could. A Stoic man doesn't need to respond immediately to feel secure. He allows patterns to emerge naturally. He understands that consistency matters more than moments, and that clarity shows itself over time when pressure is removed. When you stop reacting, tests lose their purpose. There's nothing to measure, no emotional spike to analyze, no behavior to adjust against. From her perspective, this feels unsettling not because you're cold, but because you're unreadable again. The usual tools for gauging your interest no longer produce reliable results. This is where the power dynamic fully dissolves. You're no longer being pulled back into cycles of hope and doubt. You're no longer responding to emotional fluctuations as if they require action. You remain present in your life, not suspended inside someone else's uncertainty. And that composure creates space for her. Without reactions to lean on, she's left watching her own behavior instead of yours. She notices the inconsistency. She notices the timing. She notices the difference between genuine interest and momentary curiosity. And in that awareness, regret sharpens, not because you refuse to engage, but because you no longer needed to. When tests no longer move you, they reveal more about the person offering them than the person receiving them. Number 10. You become emotionally unavailable. What happens here is often misunderstood, even by men who are living it. Emotional unavailability, in this context, has nothing to do with coldness, punishment, or unresolved pain. It isn't a wall you build out of fear, and it isn't a strategy designed to provoke longing. It's something far quieter than that. You become unavailable not because you closed yourself off, but because you stopped offering access to instability. Earlier, your emotional openness was generous. You made room for uncertainty. You stayed present even when clarity was missing. You tolerated mixed signals because you believed patience would eventually create alignment. That openness wasn't weakness, it was hope. But hope, when left ungoverned, often turns into endurance of conditions that slowly drain you. Detachment doesn't harden you, it refines you. You begin to notice that your inner peace has a cost when it's exposed to chaos, and at some point, you decide that cost is no longer worth paying. Not dramatically, not with resentment, simply with awareness. You stop stepping into emotional fog. You stop responding to confusion as if it deserves your energy. You don't suppress emotion, you choose where it's allowed to land. Stoic discipline was never about denying feeling. It was about discernment, about recognizing which experiences strengthen your character and which quietly erode it. In that sense, emotional unavailability becomes an act of self-respect rather than defense. You remain open to depth, but closed to disorder. You remain capable of connection, but unwilling to negotiate your calm. What makes this boundary so powerful is that it isn't argued. There's no explanation attached to it, no justification offered, no emotional speech announcing a change. Your behavior simply shifts. You no longer lean into instability. You no longer linger where clarity is absent. And because there's no emotional charge around this decision, it doesn't invite debate. She feels it without being told. She senses that the space she once occupied effortlessly now requires coherence. That access is no longer automatic, and that realization doesn't arrive as rejection, but as finality. Not the finality of an ending, but the finality of a standard that has settled into place. This is where regret deepens, because what's no longer available isn't your affection, but the version of you who made room for uncertainty at the expense of himself. Number 11. She feels the shift in power. It usually shows up in places you can't point to on a timeline. Moments so ordinary they almost feel invisible. A conversation ends, and for the first time she doesn't leave with the sense that she still has you afterward. A message is sent, but the familiar ripple of anticipation never returns to her body. A pause appears where urgency once lived, and nothing rushes in to fill it. A moment that once would have pulled you into explaining yourself, softening your stance, or re-establishing closeness simply passes. You remain exactly where you are present, steady, emotionally available, but no longer arranged around her response. Nothing confrontational happens. Nothing dramatic is declared. Yet, something fundamental has shifted, and she feels it the way you feel the air in a room change, without anyone touching the thermostat. In the old dynamic, the center was shared, even if you never consciously agreed to that arrangement. Without meaning to, you allowed her reactions to become part of your grounding. Her warmth could settle your nervous system. Her distance could quietly disturb it. Her attention could lift your mood, and her silence could trigger a subtle urge to repair, clarify, or re-establish connection. This wasn't weakness in an obvious sense. It was quiet dependence, the kind that hides behind patience, understanding, and emotional availability. Your inner balance kept reaching outward, not desperately, but consistently, for confirmation that everything was still okay. Detachment breaks that habit without turning you colder or more distant. You don't become uninterested. You become aligned. There's a difference. Alignment means your actions, emotions, and sense of self begin to orbit a stable center that no longer shifts with someone else's mood. And alignment has a weight that need never had. When you remove the subtle request behind your presence, the unspoken need to be chosen, to be understood, to be reassured, your energy changes shape. It no longer leans forward. It no longer waits for permission. It no longer asks to be met halfway. It becomes self-contained. And self-contained energy is what most people instinctively interpret as strength, confidence, and power. Stoicism explains this without turning it into strategy or performance. Power, in this view, is not control over another person's feelings or decisions. It is self-governance. It is the ability to remain directed from within, to let life move around you without your center moving with it. You no longer wait to see how she feels before you feel stable. You no longer read her tone as a verdict on your worth. You act from principle rather than emotional timing. Your calm isn't a response, it's a baseline. And that is why the shift feels permanent. Because what changed wasn't her behavior, it was your relationship with need. Once a man stops outsourcing his stability, the dynamic doesn't swing back and forth the way it used to. There's no return to the old tension. No quiet bargaining for reassurance. Things simply settle into a new order, quietly and steadily, as if the rules were rewritten without anyone announcing it, and everyone can feel that something irreversible has taken place. Before moving forward, pause with this idea for a moment. Notice where in your own life that subtle shift has already appeared, the moments where you no longer reached outward for reassurance, explanation, or emotional permission. That quiet recentering isn't loud, but it's decisive. Take a breath. Reflect on what changed inside you when you stopped needing a response to feel steady. And if it resonates, leave a comment sharing what you noticed in yourself. Number 12. You remain grounded regardless. There comes a stage where the story finally stops revolving around what she might do next. Whether her regret turns into words or remains something she carries quietly, you no longer feel positioned beneath it, waiting to see how it lands. You don't measure your progress by whether she reaches out. You don't scan the silence for meaning. You don't replay old moments, hoping for a different ending. What happens on her side no longer determines the stability on yours. That doesn't mean you become cold or emotionally sealed off. It means you become intact. You can acknowledge the past without being pulled back into it. You can recognize what was real, what was imagined, what you gave freely, and what you overlooked, without turning those realizations into self-criticism or longing. Your inner world is no longer fragile in the presence of memory. It holds. If her regret does surface, you meet it without urgency, not with resentment, not with triumph, not with the quiet hunger to be validated at last. You listen clearly, you respond honestly, and you remain where you are. If her regret never finds a voice, you don't feel cheated by the silence. You understand that not every realization needs to be witnessed to be real. Some lessons unfold privately, and their timing does not belong to you. This is where Stoic grounding shows its true form. The Stoic aim was never to be missed, admired, or chased. It was to be unshaken, to develop an inner posture that stays upright, regardless of praise, loss, misunderstanding, or delayed realization. You no longer seek emotional symmetry, where the other person must feel what you felt in order for balance to exist. Balance now comes from alignment with yourself. You continue living from that alignment. Your decisions are no longer reactions to emotional history. Your standards are no longer shaped by who might leave or return. You invest where there is clarity, consistency, and depth, not because you fear being alone, but because you respect your own peace too much to trade it away. And that peace is not passive, it's active. It informs how you speak, how you move, how you choose. What leaves the deepest mark is not pursuit. It never was. It's presence. A presence that doesn't ask to be understood, doesn't chase recognition, and doesn't collapse when the past resurfaces unexpectedly. That kind of groundedness stays with people long after the conversation ends, long after the opportunity passes, and long after regret finally arrives, if it ever does. Here's the closing thought to take with you. What mattered most in this entire process was never whether she regretted it, reached out, or finally understood what she lost. What mattered was the moment you stopped orienting your life around an outcome that wasn't yours to control. You didn't detach to create distance. You detached to return to yourself. And once that return happens, everything else becomes secondary. Her regret, if it comes, arrives too late to destabilize you. Her silence, if it remains, no longer defines you. You move forward, grounded, intact, and directed from within. That's not an ending, it's a position. And it's one you don't give up again. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to like the video so more men can find it. Leave a comment sharing what part stood out to you, or how detachment has changed the way you see yourself. And when you're ready, watch the recommended videos on screen. They'll take you deeper into this shift and what it looks like to live from calm, grounded self-respect. What happens when the man she thought she understood suddenly becomes unreadable, not withdrawn, not distant, but quietly self-contained? That moment doesn't announce itself, yet it changes everything. Because when your emotions stop reacting on cue and your inner world no longer spills outward, the familiar sense of predictability disappears, and something subtle begins to shift in her mind that she can't quite put into words. In this video, we're going to explore what truly happens when she can't read you anymore, why that moment feels unsettling to her, and how it marks a deeper transformation within you. If this speaks to you, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's begin. Number 1. Her certainty breaks. At the beginning, what breaks inside her isn't trust, it's certainty. And that distinction matters far more than most men realize. Trust can survive distance, silence, even periods of tension. Certainty cannot. Certainty is built on repetition, on patterns that feel reliable, on knowing, without thinking about it, how you will respond when the dynamic shifts. When she pulls back, you lean forward. When she sends a shorter reply, you soften the gap. When she goes quiet, you fill the space with reassurance, effort, or explanation. She wasn't guessing where she stood with you. She knew. Your reactions confirmed her position again and again. So when you stop reacting on cue, something unfamiliar enters her emotional world. Confusion not loud, not dramatic, but quiet and destabilizing. The kind that doesn't announce itself but lingers. She rereads messages that used to feel clear. She notices pauses that never registered before. She senses that the usual signals no longer give her clean information. What once felt automatic now feels uncertain. And that is the moment certainty begins to crack. What's important here is what didn't happen. You didn't become cold or hostile. You didn't withdraw to provoke a response. You didn't explain yourself to manage how you were perceived. You didn't try to regain control of the narrative. You simply became less readable. Your inner state stopped spilling outward in predictable ways. And to someone who was used to reading you like a map, knowing exactly where every reaction would appear, that sudden opacity feels deeply unsettling. This is where Stoic wisdom quietly enters the picture, without force or performance. The ancient Stoics believed that peace begins the moment your emotional stability no longer depends on external reassurance. Epictetus warned that when you allow others to govern your inner state, you surrender your freedom without noticing the moment it happens. When you reclaim that inner control, when your mood, confidence, and direction no longer rise and fall with someone else's behavior, you don't become distant or unfeeling. You become grounded. And grounded energy changes how everything around you is perceived. From her perspective, that grounding can feel like distance, even if nothing concrete has changed. You're still present, still respectful, still calm, but you are no longer transparent in the same way. She can't tell what a delayed reply means anymore. She can't tell whether silence signals disinterest, strength, reflection, or simply a man absorbed in his own life. And because certainty once gave her a sense of emotional security, its absence introduces tension, not fear yet, but alertness, awareness, a subtle readiness. She begins to pay closer attention, noticing tone, timing, energy, details she once overlooked because she assumed she already knew where she stood. She starts wondering instead of assuming, and that shift matters, because attraction rarely begins with certainty. It begins at the moment certainty disappears. When you stop being easy to read, you stop being easy to place. And when she can't place you, she can no longer rest comfortably in the same emotional position she once occupied. The ground doesn't collapse beneath her feet, but it moves just enough for her to feel it. And once certainty breaks, the dynamic is no longer operating on autopilot. Number 2. Curiosity replaces comfort. Once certainty breaks, comfort quietly fades with it. And in that empty space, something far more active appears: curiosity. Comfort is passive. It lives on familiarity, on emotional shortcuts, on knowing that nothing unexpected will happen. Curiosity, on the other hand, is alert. It watches, it listens, it leans forward. When you stop being an open book, she doesn't feel abandoned, but she does feel awake. Before, you made things easy. You explained your moods. You clarified your intentions. You narrated your inner world as if transparency were proof of sincerity. And while that may have felt honest, it also removed tension. She never had to wonder where she stood or what you felt. Comfort thrived there. But attraction rarely grows in comfort, it settles there. When you stop over-explaining, something subtle changes. Not because you're hiding, but because you're no longer translating every feeling into words for her benefit. Your silence isn't strategic, it's natural. You answer when you have something to say. You don't rush to soften pauses. You don't fill space just to reassure. And suddenly, she can't rely on assumption anymore. She has to observe. This is where curiosity begins its quiet work. She wonders what you're thinking, not anxiously, but attentively. She replays conversations, not to decode a problem, but to understand a man who no longer hands her emotional summaries. Your calm doesn't explain itself. Your presence doesn't chase interpretation. And that creates a pull. Stoicism speaks directly to this shift. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a man should not feel compelled to display his inner life for approval, not because privacy is power, but because self-command is. Restraint, in Stoic terms, isn't secrecy, it's discipline. It's knowing that not every emotion needs to be announced, and not every thought needs a witness. From her perspective, that restraint reads as depth. You feel less reactive, less predictable, more solid. She senses that your world doesn't orbit her reactions anymore, and instead of pushing her away, that independence invites curiosity. She leans in emotionally, not because you asked her to, but because there's something she no longer fully understands. Comfort made you familiar. Curiosity makes you interesting again. And the moment she starts wondering, instead of assuming, the emotional dynamic quietly shifts in your favor, without you ever needing to force it. Before we move on, pause for a moment and notice what this shift really represents. This isn't about creating mystery or holding back. It's about the calm that comes when you no longer feel the need to explain yourself to be understood. That quiet change is where curiosity replaces comfort and where the dynamic begins to move on its own. If this resonates, take a second to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments, or simply type, "My calm creates curiosity," to mark this moment for yourself. Number 3. She watches more closely. Once curiosity takes hold, her attention sharpens. She starts watching not obsessively, not anxiously, but with intent. Your timing, your tone, your presence when you do show up. Details that once passed unnoticed now feel meaningful, not because you suddenly became different, but because you stopped performing clarity for her comfort. Before, she didn't need to observe you closely. You explained yourself, you filled in the blanks, you made sure nothing was misunderstood. That created ease, but it also removed the need for attention. When everything is spelled out, there's nothing to study. But now, without that constant narration, she has to look for patterns, instead of relying on explanations. She notices how you don't rush replies just to manage impressions, how your tone stays steady regardless of emotional weather, how you don't lean forward when she pulls back, and you don't pull away when she leans in. Your presence feels consistent without being performative. And consistency, when it isn't announced, carries weight. What's happening here is subtle but powerful. You're no longer trying to be understood in real time. You're allowing understanding to form over time. That forces observation. She watches how you move through silence, how you respond without urgency, how you remain the same man, whether she's warm, distant, or unpredictable. And the more she watches, the more she realizes something important. Your behavior isn't shaped by her reactions. This is where Stoic thinking becomes visible without being spoken. Seneca believed that character reveals itself through repeated action, not explanation. A man proves who he is by how consistently he lives, not by how persuasively he speaks. When you stop chasing understanding, you allow others to witness you instead. From her perspective, this creates a shift in power, not the loud kind, but the grounded kind. She's no longer evaluating your words alone. She's watching your rhythm, your steadiness, your emotional posture. And because those things don't fluctuate based on her moods, they feel solid. When a man lets consistency speak, observation does the rest. She starts drawing her own conclusions instead of receiving them pre-packaged. And conclusions formed through observation tend to carry more emotional weight because they feel discovered, not delivered. Number 4. Emotional leverage dissolves. At this stage, something quietly powerful happens. The old triggers stop working. Praise doesn't pull you forward. Distance doesn't knock you off balance. Mixed signals don't create urgency in you anymore. Not because you've become indifferent, but because your emotional center is no longer exposed. And when that happens, emotional leverage disappears. Before, leverage existed without either of you naming it. A little warmth could hook you. A little silence could destabilize you. Approval lifted your mood. Withdrawal made you question yourself. None of this was malicious. It was simply how emotional dependence works. Whoever can move your inner state, even subtly, holds influence over you. And once she sensed that influence, even unconsciously, the dynamic formed around it. But when you stopped reacting automatically, that leverage dissolved. Compliments no longer changed your pace. Coldness no longer provoked correction. You didn't reward inconsistency with extra effort or punish distance with emotional explanations. You stayed steady, and steadiness is the one thing leverage cannot operate on. This is where Stoicism reveals its real strength. The Stoics never taught men to control outcomes, people, or situations. They taught control of response. Musonius Rufus emphasized that a disciplined man is not the one who avoids emotion, but the one who refuses to be ruled by it. When you master your responses, you remove the handles others once used to move you. From her perspective, this feels disorienting. She may not consciously think, "I've lost leverage," but she feels the shift. The usual emotional buttons no longer produce predictable results. Pulling away doesn't create pursuit. Leaning in doesn't make you cling. And because control often hides inside predictability, the loss of predictability feels like a loss of control. What replaces it isn't chaos, it's respect. not necessarily spoken, but felt. She realizes that you're not adjusting yourself to manage her reactions anymore. You're responding based on your own internal standards. And that changes the emotional playing field entirely. When emotional leverage dissolves, games lose their purpose. Manipulation has nothing to grab onto. And without leverage, the only way forward becomes authenticity, real connection, or nothing at all. That's the quiet power of a man who cannot be easily moved. Number 5. Silence gains weight. At this point, silence stops being misunderstood. It no longer reads as avoidance, punishment, or emotional retreat. It starts to carry weight. Not loud weight, grounded weight. The kind that makes people pause instead of panic. Before, your silence may have felt awkward or incomplete, something you rushed to fill with explanations, reassurance, or extra words. Now, it stands on its own. What changed isn't the absence of speech, but the intention behind it. You speak less, but when you do, it lands. Your words aren't padded with emotional excess or rushed to manage reactions. They're clean, direct, calm, and because they're no longer competing with constant commentary, they're noticed. She feels this shift almost immediately. Conversations feel different. Pauses don't feel tense, they feel deliberate. When you don't respond right away, it doesn't register as distance. It registers as a man who is present in his own life, not hovering anxiously around hers. Your silence doesn't ask for interpretation. It simply exists. This is deeply aligned with Stoic thought. Chrysippus believed that restraint, especially in speech, was a form of inner strength. Not because words are dangerous, but because unnecessary words dilute authority. When a man speaks only when it matters, his voice carries more gravity. Silence, used well, becomes a signal of self-command. From her perspective, your silence begins to feel meaningful rather than empty. She listens more closely when you speak, because she knows you're not filling space. You're contributing intention, and intention is felt long before it's understood. There's also something else happening beneath the surface. Silence removes pressure. You're no longer pushing emotional momentum forward. You're allowing space, and space invites reflection. She starts to sense that your calm doesn't need her participation to exist, that your presence isn't fragile, that you're not waiting to be activated by her attention. When silence gains weight, it changes the emotional atmosphere. It slows things down. It grounds interactions. It removes the noise that once blurred meaning. And in that quiet, something rare happens. Your presence becomes felt even when you're not speaking. That's when silence stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like strength. Take a moment to sit with this shift instead of rushing past it. Notice how silence feels now, less like something to manage, more like something you inhabit. This is where clarity settles in, where presence stops trying to prove itself. Reflect on what has changed in you, not just in how she responds. If this resonates, leave a comment with your thoughts, or simply type, "Silence is my strength," before we continue. Number 6. She feels the gap. Now she feels it, the gap. Not a dramatic absence, not a cold withdrawal, but a quiet space she can't fill with assumptions anymore. Before, she could rely on your reactions to orient herself. Your tone told her where she stood. Your speed told her how invested you were. Your explanations closed every emotional loop. There was always something to grab onto. Now, there isn't. This gap isn't created by distance. It's created by restraint. You're still present, still responsive, still grounded, but you're no longer broadcasting your inner state in real time. And that changes everything. She can't easily tell whether a pause means contentment, focus, or indifference. She can't use your reactions as emotional coordinates. For the first time, she has to sit with uncertainty instead of resolving it through you. This is often where discomfort arises, not panic, not fear, but awareness. The kind that makes someone more conscious of their own internal state. She notices her urge to interpret, to fill silence with meaning, to reach for clarity that used to be handed to her. And when it doesn't arrive, the attention turns inward. Stoic detachment is often misunderstood here. It isn't emotional withdrawal or coldness. It's discipline. Hierocles emphasized that emotional maturity comes from governing what you express, not suppressing what you feel. You still experience emotion, but you no longer spill your inner weather every time it shifts. You don't turn every passing feeling into a message or a mood into a signal. From her perspective, this restraint creates a subtle imbalance. Not an unfair one, just an unfamiliar one. She can't stabilize herself through your responses anymore. She has to tolerate not knowing. And in that space, something important happens. She becomes more aware of her emotional habits, her need for certainty, her reliance on feedback, her discomfort with ambiguity. The gap you create isn't meant to push her away. It's simply the space where your independence becomes visible. And when a man can sit comfortably inside his own emotional climate without exporting it for reassurance, others are quietly forced to examine theirs. That's the power of this moment. You don't fill the gap. You don't rush to close it. You let it exist. And in doing so, you reveal a kind of strength that doesn't demand attention, but changes the entire emotional dynamic. Number 7. Respect quietly rises. Something subtle shifts here, and it doesn't announce itself. There's no confrontation, no speech about boundaries, no final conversation where everything is clarified and agreed upon. Instead, respect rises quietly, almost invisibly, because you stop negotiating who you are and start living it. Before, boundaries may have existed, but they were soft. They required explanation, reinforcement, sometimes even defense. You clarified what you were okay with. You justified your limits. You explained why certain behavior didn't sit right with you. And every explanation, no matter how calm, carried an unspoken request. Please understand me. That alone weakened the boundary. Now, that pattern ends, not because you hardened, but because you simplified. You no longer argue your standards. You don't warn repeatedly. You don't threaten consequences or dramatize your expectations. You simply act in alignment with them. If something doesn't match your values, you don't engage with it. If a dynamic feels off, you don't adapt yourself to tolerate it. You move accordingly. From her perspective, this feels different. There's no friction to push against, no emotional debate to win, no loophole to negotiate. Your behavior speaks first and keeps speaking. And because it's consistent, it becomes credible. She realizes that your limits aren't reactions to her behavior. They're expressions of your character. This is where Stoic philosophy shows its quiet authority. Cleanthes believed that a man's principles only matter when they govern his actions under pressure. Words, he taught, are easy. Alignment is rare. When you stop defending who you are and simply are, people adjust, not because they're forced to, but because reality leaves them no alternative. Respect doesn't arrive as praise. It arrives as caution, as attentiveness, as a subtle recalibration in how she approaches you. She becomes more mindful of tone, more aware of timing, more careful not to cross lines you no longer redraw. And this happens without a single argument. That's the paradox. When you stop insisting on respect, you often receive it. Not loudly, not ceremonially, but steadily. Because respect is less about what you demand and more about what you refuse to abandon. When boundaries are lived instead of debated, they don't feel restrictive. They feel real. And reality, more than persuasion, is what commands respect. As you sit with this shift, notice how quiet it is. There was no announcement, no argument, no attempt to be understood, only alignment. Ask yourself where you've been explaining instead of living, negotiating instead of choosing. That awareness is where real change begins. If this resonates, leave a comment sharing what stood out to you, or simply type, "I live my standards," to mark the moment you stopped defending who you are and started embodying it. Number 8. Her emotional mirror fades. There is a moment when she begins to feel something missing, but she can't immediately name what it is. It isn't attention. It isn't affection. It's the disappearance of a familiar reflection. For a long time, your emotional state quietly mirrored hers. When she felt uncertain, you became uneasy. When she pulled back, your energy shifted. When she leaned in, you responded in kind. Without saying it out loud, she could look at you and understand herself better. You were not just present, you were responsive in a way that confirmed her internal weather. Now, that mirror fades. Your calm no longer rises or falls with her moods. Your presence doesn't tense when she's distant or brighten when she's warm. You don't absorb emotional turbulence and send it back, softened or intensified. You remain steady, not rigid, not withdrawn, but internally anchored. And because of that, something changes in the emotional exchange. She can no longer use your reactions as feedback for how she should feel. At first, this feels strange to her. Not painful, just unfamiliar. She may sense that something she once relied on is no longer there, even though nothing obvious has been taken away. Conversations still happen. Silence still exists. But the emotional echo is gone. Her moods arrive and don't immediately find a response inside you. They linger instead of bouncing back. This is where Stoic presence quietly asserts itself. The Stoics believe that peace is not something reflected from another person, but something generated internally and protected through discipline. Zeno of Citium taught that a man becomes free the moment his inner state is no longer shaped by forces outside his control. That freedom doesn't look dramatic. It looks calm. It looks unmoved. It looks like a man who feels deeply but doesn't broadcast every emotional shift as a signal. Without the mirror, she's left alone with her own emotional movement, not abandoned, simply unreflected. And in that space, awareness grows. She notices her own fluctuations more clearly, her need for reassurance, her discomfort with emotional neutrality. What once flowed outward now turns inward. This is not a punishment. It's not distance. It's clarity arriving slowly. When you stop reflecting chaos back to others, you don't create confusion. You allow truth to surface in its own time. And a man who holds his center without needing to mirror the emotional noise around him becomes something rare, a steady presence that reveals rather than reacts. That's when the mirror fades and something deeper takes its place. Number 9. She tests the unknown. This is the phase where movement returns, but it doesn't come with clarity. It comes with variation. Distance appears without explanation. Then warmth arrives, just as unexpectedly. A message shows up at an odd hour, casual in tone but deliberate in timing. The rhythm shifts, not dramatically, not aggressively, but enough to feel intentional. These aren't games in the childish sense, and they aren't manipulation either. They're tests born from curiosity, attempts to understand something that no longer makes immediate sense. When you were readable, there was no need to test. Your reactions told her everything. Now that those reactions no longer arrive on schedule, she experiments not to control you, but to locate you. She wants to see what moves you, what doesn't, what still works, and what quietly no longer does. Distance is offered to see if you close it. Warmth is extended to see if you rush forward. Uncertainty is introduced to see if you try to resolve it. What matters here is not the test itself, but how you relate to it. A Stoic man recognizes these moments without dramatizing them. He doesn't label them as threats or opportunities. He doesn't rush to interpret meaning or adjust his behavior to force an outcome. He notices the shift, acknowledges it internally, and remains where he is, not passive, not indifferent, simply steady. This restraint is not accidental. It comes from understanding something the Stoics articulated long ago. Truth reveals itself through time, not pressure. Epictetus taught that when you try to control what is not yours, other people's feelings, intentions, or decisions, you lose mastery over what is yours, your response. When you refuse to be pulled into reaction, you give reality space to speak. From her perspective, this is unexpected. The tests don't produce clear data. Distance doesn't trigger pursuit. Warmth doesn't cause attachment. Mixed signals don't shift your center. And because there is no immediate feedback, curiosity deepens rather than resolves. She watches longer. She notices patterns instead of moments. She begins to sense that whatever you're grounded in is not dependent on her moves. This is where pressure fails and patience succeeds. You don't confront the test. You don't reward it. You don't punish it. You simply allow it to pass through without resistance. And in doing so, you let something rare happen. Behavior reveals intention without being forced. That's the quiet strength of this stage. When you don't react to the unknown eventually explains itself. Pause here for a moment. Notice what this stage is really asking of you, not action, not interpretation, but awareness. It's easy to miss how much restraint you're practicing when nothing dramatic is happening on the surface, yet this is often where old habits quietly try to return. Take a breath and reflect on how you usually respond to uncertainty. Do you feel the urge to clarify, to stabilize, to reach out and resolve what feels unresolved? Or can you sit with the shift without moving toward or away from it? This is a good place to check in with yourself. If something in this resonated, leave a comment and share what you noticed, or simply type, "I stay grounded," to mark that moment of awareness. Number 10. Power shifts internally. This is where the real shift happens, and it's far quieter than most people expect. There is no moment where power is seized, no conversation where roles flip, no dramatic turning point she can later point to and say, "This is when everything changed." Nothing external announces it. Instead, power moves inward. It settles. It becomes internal rather than performative. And because it settles inside you, the dynamic around you begins to reorganize on its own, without effort or explanation. Before this shift, power lived in need. Not obvious need, not desperation or chasing, but the subtle reliance on reaction. How she responded affected how grounded you felt, even if you didn't consciously acknowledge it. Her warmth brought ease. Her distance created tension. A delayed message could quietly unsettle you. A moment of closeness could restore balance. Even when you appeared calm on the surface, part of your stability was still being negotiated externally. In that state, power was conditional. It depended on alignment, reassurance, or continuity. Now, that condition is gone. You no longer need a certain tone to feel steady, a certain response to feel secure, or a certain outcome to feel oriented. Your emotional posture is no longer waiting to be confirmed or corrected by someone else's behavior. You still notice what happens, but it doesn't decide who you are in the moment. And because of that, something fundamental shifts. You stop reaching for power, stop trying to stabilize the dynamic, stop adjusting yourself to maintain equilibrium. And paradoxically, that is when power arrives. Stoicism has always framed power this way, not as dominance, control, or leverage over others, but as self-governance. A man is powerful not when he bends circumstances to his will, but when his inner state remains ordered regardless of how circumstances move. When you govern yourself, you stop leaking authority outward in the form of need, explanation, or emotional bargaining. Your center becomes non-negotiable. From her perspective, this change is felt more than understood. She may not have language for it, but she senses that you are no longer positioned beneath the interaction, subtly adjusting yourself to keep things smooth or predictable. At the same time, you are not standing above it either, posturing, withdrawing, or performing strength. You are simply not dependent. And that absence of dependence quietly alters the emotional geometry between you. She may experience it as a loss of leverage, or as a new kind of tension she can't quite place, or even as an unexpected respect that arrives without a clear reason. What she is responding to is this: your stability no longer requires her participation. You are choosing connection, not using it to regulate yourself. Being close to her is no longer how you stay balanced. It's something you engage in freely. That is why the shift feels natural, rather than forced. You didn't demand a different dynamic. You didn't assert control or set ultimatums. You simply removed the internal habit that made you movable. And when a man can't be easily moved, the world adjusts around him without needing instruction. This is the essence of the power shift. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't seek recognition. It simply becomes the new ground everything else stands on. Number 11. You become unmistakable. At the end of this process, there is no dramatic resolution, no climactic conversation, no final revelation that neatly ties everything together in an emotionally satisfying way. There is no moment where everything is explained or validated. What becomes clear instead is something far more durable and far more rare. Whether she leans in again with renewed interest, curiosity, or warmth, or whether she slowly drifts away on her own terms, you remain centered, not guarded, not detached in a cold or dismissive sense, simply intact, steady, whole. And that quiet wholeness is the final transformation. Earlier in the journey, your sense of self may have shifted subtly depending on where you stood with her. Connection brought reassurance, a sense of grounding. Distance introduced tension, uncertainty, and a quiet internal negotiation. Even your personal growth was sometimes measured by how it influenced the dynamic. Whether it made you more appealing, more secure, more likely to be chosen. But now, something essential has changed at the root. Your inner balance no longer depends on interpretation, response, or outcome. You are not waiting to be selected in order to feel complete, and you are not destabilized by the possibility of being released. From her perspective, this shift is unmistakable. Even if she cannot fully explain it to herself, she may sense it rather than name it. You are no longer trying to be read, understood, reassured, or decoded. Your presence does not lean forward asking for clarity, and it does not lean away in self-protection. It simply exists calm, coherent, self-contained. And because it is not reaching outward for confirmation, it carries a quiet gravity. It feels solid. It feels resolved. This is where Stoic philosophy completes its arc, not as a concept, but as a lived posture. The Stoics never aimed to be admired, chased, or fully understood by others. They aimed to live in alignment with reason, character, and inner order. Epictetus taught that a man should concern himself with being aligned, not approved. When your life is governed from the inside, external outcomes lose their authority over your emotional state. They become events, not verdicts. What makes this stage so powerful is that nothing more needs to be done. There is no next move to calculate, no adjustment to make, no version of yourself left to perform or maintain. If she leans in, it is by choice, not pressure. If she lets go, It happens without chaos, resentment, or collapse. Either way, your center holds. You do not need the moment to go a certain way in order to remain at peace with yourself. And that is what leaves the lasting mark. Not intensity, not constant availability, not emotional volatility or dramatic expression, but presence. A grounded presence that doesn't flinch under uncertainty, doesn't chase clarity, and doesn't disappear when challenged. Long after words fade and interactions blur, that presence remains. Because a man who is truly centered does not need to announce himself and cannot be mistaken for anyone else. And that's where this journey truly ends, not with certainty restored, not with answers handed back, but with something far more important than being understood. When you stop trying to be readable, when you no longer shape your inner world around someone else's reactions, you don't lose connection. You reclaim authorship over yourself. What follows isn't chaos or distance, but clarity. You become a man who can stand inside silence without needing to fill it, who can remain present without negotiating his worth, and who can allow others to choose freely without that choice defining his peace. Whether she moves closer or farther away, you are no longer moved by the outcome. You are simply grounded. And that grounded presence is what cannot be replicated, replaced, or forgotten. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to like the video. It helps this message reach men who need it. Leave a comment below and share what stood out to you most, or what you're beginning to notice changing within yourself. And when you're ready, continue the journey by watching the recommended videos on screen. They build directly on this shift, and they'll take you even deeper. You didn't glow up. You didn't suddenly become someone new. What changed was quieter and far more powerful. The moment you stopped chasing, stopped explaining, and stopped needing a specific outcome, your presence shifted. You became calmer, grounded, harder to pull off your center. Stoics understood this paradox long ago. When you release control, you gain gravity. And that inner gravity is what people feel before they can explain it. In this video, we'll break down exactly why letting go made you more attractive and why it works every time. If this resonates with you, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's begin. Number 1. You stop trying so hard. At first, letting go doesn't look like strength. It looks like you're doing less. You text less. You explain less. You stop rushing to fix the vibe. You stop leaning forward emotionally like it's your job to keep the connection alive. And if you're being honest, this was probably the first time in a long time you felt the urge to panic, then didn't, because the old version of you believed effort was love. If you tried harder, you'd be chosen. If you proved yourself enough, she would feel safe, stay consistent, and value you. But the moment you let go, something surprising happened. You became more attractive. Why? Because trying too hard carries a hidden message. It says, I need this to work, or I lose. And people can feel that, not always consciously, but emotionally. When you chase connection, you don't create closeness. You create pressure. You turn a relationship into a performance, where you're always auditioning for approval. And a woman doesn't feel drawn to a man who is begging the moment to stay. She feels drawn to a man who can stand still and let truth reveal itself. This is where Epictetus's image hits hard. He told his students to imagine holding something fragile in their hand like a bird. Grip too tight, and you kill it. Hold too loose, and it flies away. The lesson wasn't be cold. The lesson was hold without fear. Most men don't lose women because they don't care. They lose women because they care with panic. They clutch. They over-message. They over-explain. They try to control outcomes that were never theirs to control. And that fear leaks out in 100 small behaviors: checking for replies, reading into tone, trying to win her back before she even left. But when you stopped trying so hard, you stopped squeezing the bird. You didn't have to announce your value. You let your peace do the talking. You allowed space to exist without treating it like danger. And space is powerful. Space is where respect is tested. Space is where a woman can actually feel your absence, not your anxiety. Here's the Stoic shift. The moment you let go, you moved your focus back to what you control, your actions, your standards, your emotional discipline. You didn't stop loving. You stopped chasing. You stopped bargaining with your self-respect just to keep someone comfortable. That's why your energy changed. You became calmer, cleaner, less reactive. And calm is magnetic because it signals safety. It signals certainty. It signals a man who is not trying to trap anyone because he knows he'll be fine either way. And that's what makes you attractive after letting go. Not because you played a game, but because you returned to the most rare trait in modern dating: emotional steadiness. You stopped forcing connection, and in doing that, you finally gave the connection a chance to breathe. Number 2, you felt more relaxed. When you finally let go, the first change wasn't in your phone. It was in your body. Your shoulders dropped. Your jaw unclenched. Your breathing stopped being shallow, like you were bracing for impact. And if you paid attention, your voice even changed. It slowed down. It stopped reaching for the right words. It stopped trying to earn a reaction. Because when you're attached, your nervous system is always on alert. You're not just talking to a person, you're negotiating your worth in real time. Every pause feels like rejection. Every delayed reply feels like a threat. And that's why you can be present with someone while your energy is still sprinting ahead, trying to control what happens next. Letting go doesn't just free your mind, it frees your nervous system. That's why you became more relaxed, and why that relaxation instantly made you more attractive. Most people don't realize this, but attraction isn't only about what you say, it's about what your energy says before you even speak. When you're tense, you transmit urgency. You transmit need. You transmit, please, don't leave. Even if you never say those words, your body says them for you. And that kind of energy isn't romantic, it's heavy. It makes the other person feel responsible for your emotional stability. But when you let go, you stopped making her the center of your emotional weather. You weren't trying to pull certainty out of her mood. You weren't trying to read the room like your life depended on it. You simply arrived as yourself, calm, grounded, unrushed. And that's rare, especially in modern dating, where everyone is secretly anxious and pretending they're not. Marcus Aurelius had a way of describing this type of man. He talked about calm presence, like a cliff facing crashing waves. The waves don't stop. They slam, they roar, they threaten. But the cliff doesn't tense to survive them. It doesn't flinch. It doesn't plead with the ocean to calm down. It just stands. That's what emotional stability looks like. Not controlling the waves, but refusing to become the waves. And the truth is, a woman feels safer around a man like that, even if she never says it out loud, because he's not volatile. He's not constantly shifting based on attention. He's predictable in the best way. Solid. Here's what changed when you relaxed. Your energy stopped rushing ahead. You stopped trying to secure the future in every conversation. You stopped treating each interaction like a test you could fail. You became present, not as a performance, but as a state. And presence is attractive because it signals abundance. It signals that you have a life, a purpose, and an inner world that doesn't collapse when someone is uncertain. It signals that you're not trying to extract reassurance, you're offering calm. And that's why letting go makes you more attractive, not because you suddenly became colder, but because you became lighter to be around. Your body softened, your voice slowed, Your eyes looked steady instead of searching. You stopped chasing the moment. You stopped forcing a vibe. You let conversation breathe, silence exist, and uncertainty pass without panicking. Calm presence isn't weakness, it's stability. It's the quiet confidence of a man who understands something most people don't. When you stop gripping life with fear, you start moving through it with power. And that kind of power doesn't need to announce itself. People feel it. Number 3. You became more real. One of the strangest things about letting go is realizing how much of your personality was actually pressure. Pressure to be liked, pressure to be chosen, pressure to stay interesting. While you're in it, you don't notice. You tell yourself you're being flexible, understanding, easy to be with. But a lot of that adjusting is fear in disguise. The fear that if you show your standards, your pace, your boundaries, you'll be rejected. So, when you finally let go, you didn't just stop chasing a person. You stopped chasing approval, and that's why you became more real. Before, you edited yourself without thinking. You held back truths to avoid conflict, laughed at things that didn't land, agreed too quickly, apologized too often, explained yourself like your feelings needed permission. That's not love, that's negotiation. And negotiation creates instability because the other person can feel you're shifting instead of standing on something solid. Once you released the outcome, what remained was consistency. Not loud confidence, quiet clarity. You spoke the same way whether you were being validated or not. You moved at your own pace. You stopped betraying yourself to keep someone close. The Stoics had an image for this. The archer. His job isn't to obsess over whether the arrow hits the target. His job is his stance, his breath, his aim, and the release. After that, the outcome no longer belongs to him. That's what changed in you. You focused on your stance, not her reaction. You stopped measuring your worth by her mood. You said what you meant, paused when you wanted to pause, and walked away from what didn't align. And that's when people began trusting you because they could feel you weren't performing. Here's what most men miss. A woman can sense when you're trying to be accepted. Even subtly, it creates imbalance. It might feel comfortable at first, but it rarely creates respect. Respect comes from clarity, from a man who knows who he is and doesn't abandon himself to keep a connection alive. So your energy shifted. You weren't nice out of fear. You were kind, but firm. Open, but not needy. Interested, but not dependent. Your words and actions matched. No overpromising. No pretending to be okay with what drained you. Authenticity returned the moment you released outcomes. Because the real you doesn't need constant strategy. He can breathe, and when a man stops adjusting himself to be chosen, he stops giving off, "please choose me" energy. He becomes the kind of man who can be chosen because he's already chosen himself. Before we move on, take a moment to sit with this. Ask yourself where you've been adjusting instead of standing, where you've been negotiating parts of yourself just to keep the peace or stay chosen. Awareness is where real change begins. If this hit close to home, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment and share what you noticed, or simply type "I choose myself now" to mark that shift. Sometimes naming it out loud is the first act of alignment. Number 4. You didn't explain yourself anymore. There is a quiet turning point that happens after you let go, and it doesn't arrive with drama or a speech. It arrives in a small internal pause, the kind where you feel the old reflex rise up, wanting to clarify, wanting to justify, wanting to make sure she understands your tone, your intention, your heart, and then you simply watch that reflex pass without obeying it. Because you finally recognize that most of your explaining was never about connection in the first place. It was about fear dressed up as maturity. Fear that being misunderstood would automatically turn into being abandoned. Fear that silence would be misread as indifference. Fear that if you didn't narrate yourself carefully enough, someone else would write the story for you, and you would lose your place in it. When you were still emotionally leaning forward, you probably explained everything in a way that felt reasonable at the time. You explained why you were busy, why you replied late, why something bothered you, why you needed space, why you cared, why you didn't mean it like that. And even when you were trying to be kind, you were unknowingly turning your inner life into a courtroom where you were always presenting evidence of being good. Because attachment makes a man believe that the right words, delivered with enough sincerity, can control an outcome that was never his to control. But letting go changes the purpose of your voice, because you stop using language to stabilize uncertainty, and you start using it only when it actually serves truth. And suddenly, the long paragraphs disappear, not because you became cold, but because you became clear. Seneca warned that constant explanation is a subtle surrender of authority, because the more you feel compelled to justify your intentions, the more you quietly accept that another person has the right to audit your motives, approve your boundaries, and decide whether your feelings are acceptable. And that is how men lose their center without noticing, not through one big betrayal, but through 100 small defenses, each one saying, "Please understand me so I can feel safe," until your peace becomes dependent on someone else's interpretation. And the deeper Stoic lesson here is not to become silent as a punishment, but to become silent as a form of inner sovereignty, where your life is not a debate club and your dignity is not something you keep on the table for negotiation. So you stopped explaining, and that decision, simple on the surface, changes the entire emotional dynamic. Because when you no longer chase agreement, people have to meet you in reality instead of in argument. They have to respond to your actions, your consistency, your presence, rather than pulling you into endless loops about tone and timing and what you really meant. And what's more is that your energy becomes lighter, steadier, and strangely more magnetic, because you're no longer broadcasting the frequency of a man who needs to be understood in order to be okay. You are still respectful, still capable of honest communication, but you are no longer available for the exhausting habit of overproving yourself. And in that calm restraint, there is a kind of power that doesn't beg, doesn't persuade, and doesn't chase. It simply stands where it belongs inside you, because silence, chosen with composure, keeps your authority rooted in your own character rather than scattered across someone else's mood. Number 5. You put your energy elsewhere. The moment you stopped pouring your attention into trying to make a connection feel safe, consistent, and certain, something almost physical began to happen. Because energy that was once trapped in waiting, overthinking, checking, and emotional forecasting finally had somewhere else to go. And when it moved, it didn't just change your schedule, it changed your identity. Since a man becomes attractive in a deeper way when his days are not organized around someone else's availability, but around his own structure, his own standards, and his own mission. At first, redirecting your energy can look simple on the outside, like you're just keeping busy. But what's really happening is more serious than that, because you're no longer using a woman as the emotional center of gravity that determines whether you feel powerful or powerless on any given day. And this is why your posture changes without you forcing it, because a man who has a purpose doesn't sit in the same posture as a man who is waiting to be chosen. And when you began focusing on work, discipline, and structure, you stopped living in reaction mode and entered something steadier, where your mood was not constantly at the mercy of messages, small signs, and shifting attention. That shift creates attraction because it produces a kind of calm that can't be faked, the calm that comes from momentum. And momentum is one of the most underrated forms of confidence, Because when you are moving forward in your own life, you don't need to chase reassurance. You don't need to force conversations to keep the bond alive. And you don't need to perform emotional intensity to prove you care. Since your care is no longer a desperate offering, it becomes a quiet choice. And the difference between those two energies is the difference between pressure and presence. The Roman Stoics understood this in a way modern men often forget, because they didn't treat discipline as something you do only when life becomes difficult. They treated it as the shape of who you are. And there's an old, vivid image that captures the point. Roman soldiers repaired armor daily, even in peace, not because war was guaranteed to arrive tomorrow, but because readiness builds identity. And identity is what holds you steady when circumstances change. They were training themselves to be the same person, regardless of comfort or chaos. And that is exactly what you started doing when you redirected your energy toward your craft, your body, your habits, and your inner order. Because you weren't trying to distract yourself, you were rebuilding the structure that makes a man reliable to himself. And when a man becomes reliable to himself, women feel it immediately, even if they can't explain why. Because your energy stops feeling like it's searching for something and starts feeling like it's moving from something, from a center, from a grounded place, from a life that is already in motion. You begin speaking with more patience because you don't need the conversation to go somewhere, to feel good about yourself. You begin listening without the hidden urgency of, "Please validate me." And you begin showing up without that subtle emptiness behind the eyes that comes from waiting for someone else to decide your worth. Purpose reshaped your posture. Not just the way you stand, but the way you carry silence, the way you handle delays, the way you respond to mixed signals. Because when your energy is invested elsewhere, you don't collapse into interpretation. You simply continue. And that continuation is what makes you attractive, since it communicates abundance without bragging, stability without stiffness, and strength without the need to control. And that, in the end, is the real result of letting go. Not that you cared less, but that you stopped wasting power on what you could never fully command. And you started building a life that would hold you upright whether someone stays or leaves. Number 6. You reacted less. There was a time when a simple delay could hijack your whole day, when a shorter reply than usual, a seen message without a response, a sudden change in tone, or a stretch of silence would pull you into interpretation. And before you realized it, you were no longer living your life. You were living inside the question of what she meant, what she felt, what she might do next, and what that supposedly said about your value. But after you let go, those same triggers lost their authority over you. Not because you became numb, but because you stopped giving every signal the power to define your state. Messages, delays, mixed signals, none of them ruled you anymore, because you stopped reacting on autopilot, and that is where your attractiveness quietly sharpened. Since a man who reacts less is a man who feels safer to be around, not in a boring way, but in a grounded way, where his energy doesn't spike and crash based on external noise, and where his calm isn't a pose, it's a practice skill. The Stoics trained this skill deliberately by building a pause between stimulus and response. And in that pause lives freedom. Because if you can feel the sting of uncertainty without instantly moving to fix it, explain it, or chase it away, then you're no longer a slave to it. You're simply aware of it. And awareness is what turns emotion from a command into information. You still notice what happens. You still register what you feel, but you don't turn it into an emergency. So when she was inconsistent, you didn't punish, you didn't plead, you didn't spiral. You simply stayed in your lane. And that steadiness changed your presence. Because instead of trying to control the situation, you controlled yourself. And self-control is what makes a man feel solid, like someone who can handle life without needing constant reassurance. You became the kind of man who can wait without suffering, who can hear silence without inventing stories, and who can respond with intention rather than impulse. When you stopped reacting, your presence became grounded. And grounded presence is magnetic because it communicates strength without aggression, confidence without performance, and emotional maturity without lectures, as if your whole being is saying, "I will not abandon my peace just to chase clarity." And that is why letting go didn't reduce your power. It returned it to you. Let that idea settle for a second. Notice what changes when you no longer hand your peace over to every pause, every delay, every mixed signal. That space you hold now isn't emptiness, it's control. It's where calm replaces urgency, and where your presence starts to speak without effort. Reflect on where you used to react, and where you now choose restraint. If this resonates, leave a comment and share what this shift has revealed to you, or where you're still practicing the pause before we step into what comes next. Number 7. You held your ground. At some point after letting go, you stopped treating your boundaries like ideas that needed negotiation and started treating them like a way of living. You didn't argue your standards anymore. You didn't explain what you deserved or convince anyone that respect matters. You simply held your ground, and that quiet firmness became one of the most attractive shifts a man can make, because nothing signals self-worth faster than consistency that doesn't ask to be understood. Before, you may have explained your limits like you were asking permission, or softened them the moment you felt resistance, not because you didn't know what you wanted, but because you feared holding the line might cost you the connection. That fear makes a man flexible in the wrong places, accepting mixed effort and unclear behavior, and calling it patience, when it's really avoidance of loss. Once you let go, you realize boundaries aren't words you say when you're upset. They're patterns you refuse to break, even when it's tempting. And the moment you live them, instead of arguing them, your standards became visible without announcements. This is where the Stoic image fits perfectly. A gatekeeper doesn't shout warnings or explain the rules, he simply doesn't open the gate. His power isn't in his voice, it's in his decision. Your standards gained weight the same way when you stopped trying to win emotional debates and let your actions do the filtering. If someone brought disrespect, inconsistency, or games, you didn't escalate or lecture. You calmly removed access. That kind of refusal carries more force than any argument. Holding your ground also changed the small moments. You stopped being overly available to uncertainty. You stopped rewarding hot and cold behavior. You stopped bending your schedule or values just to keep surface peace. And ironically, that's when you felt more peaceful inside, because you were no longer betraying yourself to keep someone close. That's what makes it attractive. A woman doesn't just respond to what you say, she responds to what you tolerate. When you tolerate less chaos and inconsistency, you create a clearer emotional environment. Your standards become a silent signal. I don't need to control you, but I will control what I allow near me. That's Stoic strength, quiet, steady, and hard to ignore. So you held your ground, and without trying to impress anyone, you became more attractive. Your consistency proved your self-respect wasn't a mood, it was a structure. And once a man reaches that point, people either rise to meet him or fade, and either way, he stays intact. Number 8. You accepted what you couldn't control. What made you more attractive after letting go wasn't a change in looks or status. It was the way you stopped wrestling with uncertainty. You no longer treated outcomes like something you could force into your favor if you just tried harder. You let things unfold without grasping, bargaining, or quietly wishing reality would be different. That kind of acceptance is rare, because most people say they want peace while still living, as if peace only comes after they control every variable. When you were attached, Control showed up in subtle ways, needing the right tone from her to feel calm, the right amount of attention to feel secure, the relationship to go somewhere, so your time felt justified. Even when you called it love, it often carried tension, because you were asking the future to reassure you before you could relax. Letting go forced you to face a hard truth with clarity. You can't control whether someone chooses you, stays consistent, communicates clearly, or values what you offer. And the more you tried to control those things, the more anxious and reactive you became, and anxiety is felt long before it's seen, draining attraction almost instantly. The Stoics trained themselves for this reality through the rehearsal of loss, not to suffer early, but to remove fear. Fear is the real chain. Fear makes you tolerate mixed signals, over-explain, chase closure, and hand your emotional stability to someone else. By mentally facing loss, status, comfort, relationships, they stripped it of its power. When fear loosens its grip, decisions become cleaner. That's what happened to you. You stopped needing guarantees, and the power dynamic shifted. When you're no longer afraid of losing someone, inconsistency, silence, and emotional games lose their leverage. Manipulation only works when fear is active. When someone senses you're afraid to lose them, they can pull away, offer crumbs, or keep you suspended in hope. But when you accept what you can't control, you quietly step out of that trap, saying without words, "If this is real, it will stand. If it isn't, I won't sacrifice myself to keep it alive." That calm acceptance is deeply attractive. It signals strength without intimidation and maturity without explanation. You respond to what is, not to what you wish were true. You still care, but you don't cling. You still desire connection, but not at the cost of dignity. And in that space, something shifts. You move through relationships, knowing your life remains yours, no matter what anyone else decides. Letting go didn't make you empty, it made you free. And in the Stoic sense, freedom is the most magnetic confidence there is. Number 9. You valued yourself more. After you let go, you didn't magically become perfect, but you stopped treating attention like the scoreboard of your worth. And that single change ended a pattern that quietly drains men, the pattern of negotiating for connection, where you offer extra effort to inconsistency, extra patience to mixed signals, and extra explanations to someone who's unsure, not because it's noble, but because a part of you is afraid that if you stop, you'll lose the only thing making you feel chosen. When your value is tied to attention, even small crumbs can reset your standards. A late-night message, a sudden burst of affection, a brief moment of warmth that makes you forget the weeks of distance, and you call it hope, but it's really dependency on signals. Letting go breaks that dependency, because you start measuring yourself by something stronger than someone's mood. You measure yourself by how you show up, how you keep your word, how you handle silence without collapsing into overthinking, and how you maintain discipline even when no one is rewarding you for it. The Stoics believed a man's value is proven when no one is watching, because character is what remains when you remove applause. And that's why your inner certainty grew in the quiet, not in the moments where you were praised, but in the moments where you weren't, where you had the choice to chase validation or choose self-respect. And each time you chose self-respect, you reinforced a new identity, one that doesn't beg to be treated well. It simply expects alignment. That inner certainty changed how others treated you because your energy stopped asking for permission. You spoke with less urgency. You listened without trying to earn. You stopped over-explaining your intentions. And you stopped tolerating what used to confuse and drain you. Because valuing yourself makes you interpret behavior more clearly. Inconsistency becomes inconsistency. Distance becomes distance. And disrespect stops being something you work through and becomes something you step away from. So your worth stopped negotiating for attention, and people felt it. Because when a man doesn't need to be chosen to feel whole, his presence carries a quiet gravity, and that gravity naturally invites more respect, more seriousness, and a different kind of attraction, the kind that isn't built on chasing, but on character. Pause for a moment and notice what actually shifted here. It wasn't confidence you performed. It was standards you stopped negotiating. Reflect on the times you held your ground, instead of chasing clarity or reassurance, and how that felt in your body and mind. If this struck something real, leave a comment sharing what part resonated with you most, or simply type, "I master what I do not chase." Sometimes, naming the shift is the first step in making it permanent. Number 10. You chose peace. After letting go, the most decisive move you made wasn't walking away from a person. It was walking away from the habit of trying to control how people feel about you. Because control is exhausting in a way most men don't admit. It makes you monitor tone, timing, and reactions, like your life depends on it. It makes you adjust yourself mid-conversation. It makes you carry the invisible responsibility of keeping everything okay. And over time, that turns love into management. Where you're not building connection, you're constantly preventing loss. But when you chose peace, you stopped running that program. You stopped trying to steer emotions that were never yours to steer. And you chose calm instead, not as a vibe, but as a decision. This is why your attractiveness deepened. Because calm that comes from choice is different from calm that comes from convenience. It doesn't disappear the moment something feels uncertain. It doesn't crumble when someone tests you with silence or mixed signals. It stays, and that steadiness makes your presence feel safe, powerful, and self-contained. As if your emotional center is inside you, rather than in someone else's hands. You weren't retreating from life. You were reclaiming your command. Because a man who can keep his peace without needing external reassurance is a man who can be trusted, not just by others, but by himself. Marcus Aurelius described peace as an inner citadel, a fortress within, protected not by walls of stone, but by discipline of mind. And he warned that it is unreachable unless you open the gates yourself, because most threats to peace don't come from the outside. They come from the moment you let an outside reaction decide your inside state. You open the gates when you make someone's attention your oxygen, when you make their approval your medicine, when you make their confusion your emergency. And once you see that, you realize peace is not something people take from you. It's something you hand away every time you abandon your own center to chase control. So choosing peace meant you stopped chasing clarity at any cost. You stopped arguing to be understood. You stopped pushing for closure from someone who couldn't give it cleanly. And you stopped trying to fix what wasn't yours to fix, because you finally understood that peace is not passive. Peace is active restraint. It is the strength to let things be what they are, without forcing them to become what you wish they were. And when you operate from that place, you move differently. You respond slower. You speak with fewer words. You don't escalate. You don't beg. And you don't punish. You simply hold your line and keep your inner world intact. Peace wasn't retreat. It was command. Because you didn't choose it as an escape. You chose it as a standard. And that standard changed everything. Since a man who protects his calm becomes harder to manipulate, harder to destabilize, and harder to pull into emotional chaos. And in a world where so many people are reactive, anxious, and hungry for validation, that quiet inner citadel becomes the most noticeable thing about you. The kind of presence that doesn't demand attention, yet somehow pulls it, because it signals what everyone is secretly looking for: stability, clarity, and a man who belongs to himself. What all of this leads to is simple, but not easy. Letting go didn't make you colder, distant, or detached from life. It made you clearer. You stopped fighting reality, stopped negotiating your worth, and stopped handing your peace to situations you couldn't control. In doing that, you returned to yourself. And when a man stands in himself calm, grounded, and self-directed, his presence changes without effort. People don't feel pulled by anxiety anymore. They feel steadiness. They feel certainty. They feel a man who isn't trying to be chosen, because he's already chosen his own standards, his own direction, and his own peace. That's why letting go made you more attractive. Not because you played a strategy, but because you removed fear from the equation. You replaced reaction with intention. You replaced control with self-command. And once that shift happens, it doesn't just affect dating, it affects how you move through every part of your life. If this video resonated with you, take a moment to support the channel. Like the video, leave a comment sharing what stood out to you or what letting go changed for you personally, and keep going by watching the recommended videos on screen. Each one builds on this same foundation of calm, clarity, and inner strength.